Welcome back, coders. In this episode, we're going to be completing the prototype we started a couple weeks ago. We're going to be creating the markup for the UI to interact with the constraints that the OpenAI image API has. So we have to model the parameters that the API takes, and we're going to do it in such a way that we can make use of Microprofile to generate all the boilerplate for the client for us. So we're just going to model the interface for the OpenAI images generation API, and we will let Microprofile do the heavy lifting for us. We're going to be deploying this in Parjara as usual because it's simple. And I'm also going to be showing you how to create your own endpoints, call them, process the response, and with the response, generate the UI elements that will allow you to provide your users with a way to interact with your API. So we're going to add the constraints for each of the parts of the model. For example, the DALI 2 model allows us to choose between 1 and 10 images, while the DALI 3 only allows one image. So it doesn't make any sense to provide a UI element when the input is fixed or static. And remember to, if you have any ideas how to improve this, leave a comment down below. Or if you see something or a mistake I made, you can point it out in the comment section. All right, so get comfortable and let's code. Okay, continuing with our theme of creating our first web component, we're going to be adding some markup to our HTML page. And the first thing we're going to do is add a script. So this script is of type module. This will allow us to use the browser's module functionality. And also, I'm going to add our first custom element. This custom element, I'm going to be declaring it inside this JavaScript file, but you can also modularize it and create separate elements in separate files. In our app.js, I'm going to just create a class, and I'm going to extend a regular HTML element. And at the bottom, I'm just defining my custom element. And as you can see, it has a dash in the middle. That's a requirement you have to follow when you're creating custom elements. And I'm pointing to the class. Right now, this class does nothing. It's just calling the super constructor in the HTML element. And one more thing, I also, when I created the custom, when I declared the custom element and I placed it in the markup, NetBeans was telling me that I needed to have this custom element declared. And when I accepted, it created this customs.json that has an inventory of all the custom elements I'm using. Okay, right now this does nothing, so let's try to give it a bit of more functionality. So let's start with our first lifecycle function, and this is the connected callback. I'm going to be adding a link at the bottom in the description where you can read more on the documentation of how custom elements and their lifecycle work. In this case, I'm just going to do a hello there. And once I save this, let's try to see how that looks. Okay, after hitting run in NetBeans, we should be shown this output. And as you can see, now we have our hello there in the middle. If we hit inspect, we'll be able to go into the article, and this is our tag, the image dash generation. And inside we placed a span with the text hello there. Okay, let's continue. And I have now removed a few things from our custom element. Let's focus on the backend. For now, let's look at the documentation for the OpenAI image generation API. Okay, so here we are looking at the documentation, and when you get in, you're going to be presented with tutorials, quick starts, and I like to go to the API reference first and then to images and how to create an image. So we see here that we need to submit a post request to this URL, and it creates an image for a given prompt. All right, so the body of the request is what we're interested in. If we're going to create a library to consume this API, then we need to take a look at the parameters that it takes as input. Let me focus on one that might be more useful, like, for example, the response format. It says the response format in which the generated images are returned. It must be one of URL or b64_JSON. So what we have here is an enum in Java. So it must be one of these choices. So let's try to model that in our application, and let's try to make a widget that will allow us to choose one of these two options. What I'm going to do now, I have already done it, but what I did before was create a new package. I gave it a name, in this case format.boundary. And I did the same for images.entity. So I created two packages. And inside one of the packages for the formats, I'm going to create the enum. In this case, I'm going to be importing a few things just to speed things along. And all right, let me, for the enum itself, I'm going to be using, in this case, Jackson to convert this to JSON. And let me just import a few things more. Okay, oh, and I'm forgetting that I also need to import the dependencies for this. Since I know I'm going to be deploying into Pajara in this case, I'm going to save some time by just importing the whole BOM, the bill of materials, from these repositories, and just adding the relevant Jackson libraries. They're all provided, so they don't add anything to they don't add any size to my final war. Okay, in this case, this should be okay. Now that I have everything done, it's recognized, perfect. So let me explain what I'm doing here. In this case, I have an enum, and I have the two choices, either URL or b64_JSON. And these are the keys for both of those. I'm saying that when they're represented as JSON, they should be called this and this. So they're exactly the same in this case. And for these two, these are my way of converting or adapting from the enum to a textual representation. So in this case, to make it a string, I'm just going to output the key as is. And if I have a string and I want the response format back, I'm going to do the value of the key to uppercase. Okay, so now that we have that, and we have also the resource, I'm going to explain a little bit what the resource does. So when you hit this endpoint, you're going to receive all the options for the response formats. That way you can present it to your users, and then you can create a widget on the front end so that your users can decide which format to use. So I'm getting an enum set of all of the response formats available, and I'm going to stream this into a hash map. And then I'm going to return the list of these options. To have a look at how this behaves, let's try to just do a simple fetch. Okay, so after running the application as we have it right now, let's try to do a simple fetch. And what I'm doing here is fetching from my endpoint. So this is the application, and my endpoint is v1 response dash formats. I'm going to get the JSON, and then I'm just going to print it out to the console. So we have the response here and here. And as you can see, it's a list, and each item in the list is a dictionary or a hash map. And it has a value and a key. This way I can have a display output and also something that my application understands. In this case, I could display URL in uppercase, but I could send URL in lowercase if the user chooses this option. Okay, and another way of taking a look at the response we got, this is the request URL. We did a get, we got a 200 OK, and for the response we got our list, and our two options are here. So, and they're separate. Now, what do we do with this JSON? We need to be able to perform this exact call from our front end once the custom element is available in the screen. So what I'm going to do is, in this case, I'm going to create a response formats.js file. And here I'm going to paste this code. And this code does exactly what we did with the fetch, right? In this case, this is just a function, and the function receives nothing as input. And it's an async function, so we're using await to fetch this URL. We're waiting for the response. We're converting it to JSON. This is different. I'm used to launching events in case we have listeners. In this case, I'm saying, hey, there's a response formats event, and as a payload, I'm going to return the options we have. We're not going to use it right now, but in the future, if someone subscribes to these events, then they can receive an event every time the response formats change. I'm dispatching the event for the window, and it bubbles, and that's it. And I'm exporting this function so that we can use it elsewhere. In this case, I think we're going to use it here, and I'm going to try to do this in a sensible manner. Let me see if I can have everything ready so that I can explain it more clearly. Yeah. Instead of doing what we did before and setting the inner HTML directly from the connected callback, I'm going to start using lit HTML. So in this case, I'm just doing the HTML in render. And here's my function. So I'm importing this function from my file, and I'm going to use it inside. Okay, so let's see if we can make this a little neater. All right, let me explain what all of this is. As we saw before, we were just calling the superconstructor. In this case, I'm going to be reading the parameters of the URL to see if there is a predefined or pre-selected format that I need to be checking. So I'm gonna look for this, and since in the documentation it says that by default it's URL, I'm going to follow the same rules, right? If we don't have a pre-selected format from the URL, then I'm going to set one. I'm going to set this root as the shadow root we have here. In this case, it's open, but we can close it as well. Here's one of those event listeners I told you about. I like to just add a simple event listener for every time I launch an event. I can also consume it. And the way I'm consuming it in this case is I'm not doing anything with it. I'm just displaying it in the console. Okay, and the big thing is the render function. In this case, I created this render function. And what this does is fetch the formats using our function. It's an async await thing again. And then I'm going to build the markup with that response. And that's going to be added to my markup. For the template, I'm using the HTML function, well, the template literal from lit HTML. And I have a few styles just to make it look better, you can take a look at the GitHub repo for this. And I'm creating a simple form with a field set for the response format. I have, this comes from the way we built the markup using the options we got from the endpoint. And we're just calling the render function with that template on the shadow root. Okay, and now the interesting part of this is how we build the radio buttons for the options. Here, I'm just taking each of the options we have and looking for the display name of the proper option and building an input of type radio. In this case, we have two choices, URL or b64_JSON. And once we have, if we have one selected, then it's going to be checked. If it's not selected, it's not going to be checked. And that's what I'm returning. I'm returning the item templates for this. This is a way, I'm going to also leave a link to the lit HTML documentation so that you can read more about this. But basically, I'm just building an array of item templates that call the HTML template function from lit HTML. And that is what gets added to our main render function. Having done this, then we can now check. After it redeploys, we should be getting something like this. As you can see, every time you refresh, then you get the event because we made the call to the response formats. We get the event with the options. We're not doing anything except outputting to the console. This comes from the way we're building the markup. So in this case, we're building the markup with this information. And for the display name, I'm taking this URL and making the first letter uppercase. If we select the radio buttons, you can see that the ID is the key and the value is the lowercase part. The same thing for the other one. In this case, we have the value like this and uppercase for the first letter. And we're going to do this for all the options that we have in the documentation. In this case, we have the response format, we have sizes, we have styles, we have the quality. The number of images is going to be a bit different. We're going to use a range for this because it goes from 1 to 10. So we want to constrain the user to only selecting the values that are reasonable for the API call. For DALL-E 3, we can only select one image. We can only generate one image at a time. So we're going to deal with that as well. And the model, right now we only have two models, which is DALL-E 2 and DALL-E 3. And we're going to give a free text for the prompt. I think this is the only input we have that is free text. All the other ones are enums or ranges. Okay, so now I'm going to start doing the same thing for the rest of the enums, and I'm going to fast forward this so that it's the same procedure, and you can check the code in the GitHub repo.
A few moments later.
One thing I haven't talked about is the fact that you do need to have an API key to make the calls to this endpoint. If you're going to make the calls, you must have the API key, and that API key will give you access to making those calls. The API key, you can request it by logging in, creating an account, and then you must have your billing set up. And if you want to know the pricing, you can go to this URL, openai.com/pricing. And in this case, we're dealing with the image model. And you can see if you use DALL-E with a standard quality for this resolution, then you're going to pay 4 cents per image. If you go above, 8 cents per image. For DALL-E 3 in high definition, it starts at 8 cents and goes up to 12 cents. And for the older model, DALL-E 2, it's 2 cents per image at most, or 1.8, 1.6 cents for smaller images. So once you have your API key, you need to copy the API key and you're going to set it in one of the properties files we have. In this case, this is my API key. And I have set a few properties that make use of the register RestClient microprofile feature to call the external API. In this case, I'm dealing with the image service, and I'm telling it, look, the URL for this is this here. And the real service, you can call it here. As you can see, this all goes to my local server. But if you want to call the real API, then you can uncomment this line and it'll work exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to be leaving the video here because I think it's getting a bit long. And in the next video, I'm going to be completing the calls to the API. As you can see, we have a few images that we have already received from the endpoints. If you liked this video and found it useful, please like, subscribe, and comment below if you saw me make any mistakes or if you have any ideas on how to improve this series. Okay, have fun, and I see you in the next one. Happy coding!